My name is Cleo Hartley, and I am 27 years old. I planned my wedding for 18 months. Not casually, with the specific, organized attention of someone who had known since she was 12 exactly what kind of day she wanted and had spent a decade and a half building toward it. I had a binder, color-coded tabs, a vendor spreadsheet with contact names, contract dates, deposit amounts, and backup options for every single category. My fiancé called it the war room. He was not wrong. 3 weeks before the wedding, my florist called me to confirm the centerpiece change. I said, "What centerpiece change?" She said she had received an email from my mother updating the floral arrangement from the low garden-style centerpieces we had chosen to tall formal arrangements with white roses and eucalyptus. She said the revised menu had also come through, and she wanted to confirm we still needed the corsages for the original guest list since the headcount appeared to have increased. I said, "What revised menu? What headcount increase?" She said, "Mrs. Hartley reached out last Tuesday. She said you had discussed some changes and wanted them implemented before the final invoice." I had not discussed any changes with anyone. I thanked my florist and told her to hold everything pending my confirmation. I hung up. I sat very still at my kitchen table for approximately 45 seconds. And then I opened my vendor spreadsheet and I started calling down the list. By the time I had called 5 vendors, I knew the shape of what had happened. By the time I had called 9, I had a complete picture of the past 7 days of my mother's activity. She had contacted every single vendor I had booked. She had introduced herself as the mother of the bride with authority to make decisions. She had changed the floral arrangements, expanded the menu, increased the headcount by 40 guests, removed 3 of my closest friends from the seating chart to make room for family members I had either never met or had deliberately not invited, and arranged to have the ceremony music changed from the string quartet we had chosen to a pianist who played the repertoire she preferred. She had done all of this in 7 days, by phone and email, without telling me. And she had done it 3 weeks before a wedding I had spent 18 months building. Tell me where you're watching from right now. Drop it in the comments, I read every single one. Subscribe to Karma Archives before we go any further, because what I did in the 48 hours after that phone call from my florist is something I am still proud of in the specific, quiet way that you are proud of things you did when you were genuinely tested. Now let me take you back to 18 months earlier and the conversation where this started, because to understand what my mother did, you need to understand what she had been telling me for 3 years about the wedding she believed I owed her. My mother's name is Patricia Hartley. She is 54 years old and has, for as long as I can remember, related to significant events in my life primarily in terms of how they would reflect on her. This is not a dramatic characterization, it is a pattern I identified gradually over many years. The way you identify a pattern when you are inside it and therefore cannot see its full shape until you have enough distance to turn around. When I was accepted into college, her first call was to her sister to announce it. When I graduated, she cried at the ceremony, genuinely cried, and I understood later that the tears were real, but that what she was crying about was a feeling she was having about herself, about the kind of mother she had been, about the story she got to tell people at the reception. I was present at the event. The event was about her. I had known this about her for a long time without naming it. What I had not known, what I would learn in the 18 months of wedding planning, was how completely she had expected my wedding to be an extension of the story she wanted to tell, and how unprepared she was for the discovery that it was not going to be. I got engaged in the fall. My fiancé Daniel is quiet, specific about what he values, and the least interested in spectacle of any person I have ever been close to. He proposed in the kitchen of our apartment with a ring his grandmother had left him, no camera crew, no coordinated friends hiding in the bushes, just the 2 of us and a Tuesday evening and a question he had apparently been working up to for 6 months. I said yes before he finished the sentence. When I called my mother, she was happy, genuinely happy, I believe that. And then, within the same conversation, she began describing the wedding. Not asking. Describing. She said we would want a venue that could accommodate at least 200 people. She said the color palette should be classic, which I understood to mean white and ivory and the particular floral aesthetic she associated with weddings she had attended that had impressed her. She said she had already reached out to a photographer she had heard about from her friend Donna, whose daughter had gotten married in June. She said she was thinking fall, the following October, because fall was beautiful and October weddings were always so elegant. I let her talk. I had learned, over 27 years, that interrupting my mother mid-vision was less efficient than letting the vision complete itself before I introduced the reality of what I actually wanted. The reality was this. Daniel and I wanted a small wedding. 60 people. The people who had actually been present in our lives, friends, immediate family, the colleagues who had become genuine rather than professional friends. We wanted it outdoors, in the late afternoon light, at a botanical garden 40 minutes outside the city that had a ceremony lawn and a reception pavilion, and that had been the place I had first told Daniel I loved him, which felt like a good reason to choose it. We wanted a string quartet and garden-style florals and a caterer who did small-batch American food and a menu that felt like something we would actually eat. We did not want 200 people and ivory and a fall ballroom. I told my mother this in December. I was specific and calm. I used phrases like, "This is what Daniel and I have decided," and "we're really clear about the vision," in a deliberate attempt to communicate that the decisions had been made rather than were still being made. She said, "60 people is not a wedding, Cleo. That's a dinner party." I said, "It's our wedding and we like it." She said she had already spoken to the photographer. I said I was sorry she had done that before we discussed it and that we had already booked a photographer. The conversation ended with the particular tension of a disagreement that has not been resolved, but has been tabled, the kind where both people know the subject is not closed, but have run out of productive language for the moment. I went home. I told Daniel. He said, "How do you want to handle it?" I said, "I'll keep being clear and see if she adjusts." He said, "And if she doesn't?" I said, "Then we'll handle that when it arrives." It arrived 3 weeks before the wedding, via a phone call from my florist. 3 weeks before my wedding, my florist called to confirm the centerpiece change. I hadn't made any centerpiece change. She said my mother had emailed her the previous Tuesday with updates, new florals, revised menu, expanded headcount. She said it with the apologetic tone of someone who had realized mid-sentence that she was delivering news rather than confirming it. I thanked her. I told her to hold everything. I hung up. Then I opened my vendor spreadsheet and started calling down the list. By vendor number 5, I knew the shape of it. By vendor number 9, I had the full picture. My mother had contacted every single vendor I had booked. She had changed the flowers, expanded the menu, added 40 guests I had never approved, removed 3 of my closest friends from the seating chart, and rearranged the ceremony music. In 7 days. 3 weeks before the wedding, I had spent 18 months planning. And she had done it without telling me a single word. The first call I made after finishing the vendor list was to my wedding planner, a woman named Simone who had been helping me coordinate logistics for the final 6 months and who had, I would learn, already received 2 calls from my mother that she had not known how to process. Simone picked up and said, before I could speak, "Cleo, I was about to call you." I said, "Tell me what you know." She told me. My mother had called her twice in the preceding week. In the first call, she had introduced herself and described, in a pleasant, authoritative tone, a series of modifications she wanted made to the wedding that she said Cleo had approved and just hadn't had time to communicate formally. In the second call, when Simone had asked for written confirmation from me before making changes, my mother had said something Simone had written down because it had struck her as worth documenting. She had said, "I'm the one paying for this wedding. I don't need written permission from my daughter to make decisions about it." She was not the one paying for the wedding. Daniel and I had saved for 3 years and were paying for it ourselves. My mother had contributed $2,000 18 months earlier for the engagement party. That was the full extent of her financial involvement. I asked Simone to send me a complete log of every communication my mother had had with the vendors she knew about. I told her I would handle the rest. Then I called an attorney. Not because I believed what my mother had done was primarily a legal problem, it was primarily a personal one, between a mother and a daughter who had a specific and long-running disagreement about whose life the daughter's life was. But because some of what my mother had done touched legal territory, specifically, the vendors who had received instructions and potentially changed their service agreements based on the representation that she had authority to make those changes on my behalf. The attorney was a woman named Katherine Bell who handled contract and civil disputes. She had a practice that included, among other things, event contract disputes, and she was direct in the way that useful attorneys are direct. I told her what had happened. She asked 3 questions. Whether the original contracts were in my name, whether any vendors had already begun work on the altered arrangements, and whether my mother had provided any written documentation representing herself as an authorized decision-maker. I said yes to the first. I said 2 vendors had begun preliminary work. And I said 1 vendor had received an email in which my mother had introduced herself as co-host of the event with joint authority over all arrangements. Katherine said, "The co-host representation is your strongest point." She misrepresented her authority in writing to a vendor, which exposes her to a claim for any costs incurred as a result of that misrepresentation. More immediately, every vendor has a contractual relationship with you, not with her. You can revoke her access and restore the original agreements. If any vendor has already incurred costs for work they began on the basis of her instructions, those costs are a civil matter between you and her. I asked what I needed to do immediately. She said, "Contact every vendor in writing today. Confirm that your original contracts are in effect, that no modifications have been authorized, and that all future communications must come from you or from Simone as your designated planner. Do it in writing. Email is sufficient." Today. I said, "Done. What else?" She said, "You may also want to consider whether you want legal correspondence sent to your mother notifying her that any further contact with your vendors constitutes tortious interference with your contracts. It's a strong step, and it communicates serious consequences for continued interference." I thought about that for approximately 4 seconds. I said, "Send it." I spent the next 4 hours at my kitchen table sending emails. 12 vendors. Every one of them received a written communication from me, not angry, not dramatic, simply precise, confirming the original contract terms, revoking any changes made on the basis of communications from Patricia Hartley, and specifying that all future inquiries from her regarding the event should be directed to my wedding planner and not implemented without my written authorization. The responses came in over the following hours. Every single vendor confirmed receipt and restoration of the original arrangements. 2 of them, the florist and the caterer, noted that they had not yet begun work on the modifications and were relieved to revert. One vendor, the rental company that had been asked to increase the chair count, said they had already placed the order and there would be a cancellation fee. I told them to cancel it and I would handle the fee. I handled the fee. It was $112. I paid it without discussion because it was not worth the conversation and because I was conserving my energy for things that mattered. Then I called Daniel. He listened to the whole account without interrupting. He had known my mother long enough to be unsurprised by the event itself and to understand that I was not calling for sympathy or for a reaction. I was calling to inform him of a situation I was managing and to make sure he was current. When I finished, he said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "I need you to know exactly what happened and to be ready for Saturday." He said, "I'm ready for Saturday. Have been for a year and a half." The legal letter from Katherine went to my mother on a Thursday. It was 2 pages. It outlined the misrepresentation she had made to vendors, the tortious interference with my contracts, and the legal consequences of any further contact with vendors or guests in connection with the event. It did not make demands beyond immediate cessation of the interference. It was, as Katherine had described it to me, a communication designed to make absolutely clear that I had legal representation and was prepared to use it. My mother called me 17 minutes after receiving it. I did not answer. She left a voicemail. It was 4 minutes and 20 seconds long. I have listened to it twice, once on the Thursday it arrived, once about a month later when I was ready to think about it more clearly. The voicemail moved through several distinct emotional registers. The first was injured. She had only been trying to help. She didn't understand why I was involving lawyers. This was not how families handled things. The second was justificatory. The wedding was too small. The people who mattered weren't invited. She had connections and relationships, and she had only been trying to make it what it deserved to be. The third was something harder to characterize, a low, quiet statement that she had given a lot to my life, and that she had expected to be part of this, and that what I was doing felt like a rejection of everything she had ever done for me. I sat with that third register for a long time. Because unlike the first 2, which were manageable, I could identify them as the predictable responses of someone who had been caught overstepping and was reframing the overstepping as care. The third one cost me something to hear. Not because I believed it was accurate, but because there is a specific kind of grief in hearing your mother describe your boundary as an act of violence against her, and that grief does not become smaller just because the boundary was correct. I called my therapist. We talked for an hour. She helped me put the voicemail down without either dismissing it or being crushed by it. I went to bed. I slept 6 hours, which was 2 more than I had expected. In the morning I called my 2 closest friends, both of whom had been removed from the seating chart by my mother and both of whom I had already called the previous day to confirm they were absolutely still coming, and I told them what had happened in full. One of them laughed, not cruelly but with the specific helpless laughter of someone who had watched my mother operate for years and was not shocked. The other was quiet for a moment and then said, "Are you okay?" And I said yes, and I meant it, and the fact that I meant it surprised me a little. 2 weeks before the wedding, I made one more decision. I consulted with Katherine about whether I could have a formal no-contact order or cease and desist regarding the vendors. She said the letter already covered that legally and that a formal no-contact order for a family member would require a different and more significant legal process that was probably not warranted by the circumstances. What I could do, she said, was have a process server deliver a formal written notice to my mother on the morning of the ceremony confirming the vendor communication prohibition and stating that any contact with vendors or event staff on the day of the wedding would be treated as intentional interference subject to civil action. It was, Katherine acknowledged, an unusual step. I thought about it for one day. I authorized it. On the morning of September 14th, my wedding day, a process server in a dark suit drove to my mother's house in the suburb where she had lived for 30 years and delivered an envelope to her door at 8:45 in the morning. Inside was a single page, legal language at the top, my signature at the bottom, and in the body, in clear professional prose, the confirmation that I was getting married that afternoon exactly as I had planned, that the vendors had been notified, that all arrangements were final, and that any contact with event personnel would be considered tortious interference. My mother called me 23 minutes after the delivery. I did not answer. I was sitting in the getting ready suite at the Botanical Garden, having my hair done by a woman I had booked 9 months ago, listening to the string quartet doing a sound check on the ceremony lawn outside the window, drinking coffee that my best friend had brought me in a cup with my name on it, because she was my best friend and that was the kind of person she was. The phone buzzed twice on the counter. I looked at my friend. She looked at me. Then she turned the phone face down and said, "Tell me what your vows sound like again." I told her. She said they were perfect. I said I knew. And I went back to the window and listened to the quartet and watched the September light come through the trees onto the ceremony lawn, and I let myself feel, for the first time in 3 weeks, something unambiguous and uncomplicated. I was getting married. Exactly as I had planned. On my terms and Daniel's terms and nobody else's. The ceremony was 61 people. We had miscounted one family member. The extra chair appeared without drama because Simone was excellent and had planned for exactly this kind of contingency. The late afternoon light through the trees was everything I had imagined it would be when I had stood in that garden on a Sunday afternoon 2 years earlier and told Daniel I loved him for the first time. The string quartet played the pieces we had chosen. The garden centerpieces were exactly right. The caterer's food was the small batch American menu we had designed, and my grandmother, Daniel's, who had come in from Ohio, said the biscuits tasted like something from her own kitchen, which was the best possible review. We were married at 5:23 in the afternoon. I cried. Daniel cried. The officiant, who had known us both for 6 years and who had written the ceremony around the specific, private language of our relationship, cried as well and then laughed at himself for it, which made everyone in the lawn laugh, which was exactly right. At no point during the ceremony or the reception did anyone other than the 61 people we had invited attempt to attend. The vendors operated according to the original contracts, without modification, as I had confirmed in writing. Simone managed the day with the quiet authority of someone who had been managing events for 15 years and who had been given, for once, a clean situation to execute because the person creating the complications had been formally excluded from access to the operational layer. I danced with Daniel to the song we had chosen. I danced with my father, who had known about the whole situation and who had said, in a characteristically brief phone call 2 weeks earlier, "Your mother made her choice. You're making yours. I'll be there Saturday." He was there. He danced well. At 9 o'clock, when the reception was winding down and the caterer was clearing the last of the dessert course and the quartet had packed up and the remaining guests were gathered in small warm clusters under the pavilion lights, I sat with Daniel at our sweetheart table, and I looked at the botanical garden in the September evening, and I felt something I want to try to describe accurately. Not triumph. Not relief, exactly. Something quieter and more complete than both. The specific satisfaction of a person who knew exactly what she wanted, spent 18 months building it, had it threatened from an unexpected direction, held the line, and arrived at the thing she had been building toward with every detail intact. We had the wedding. Exactly as planned. On our terms, the whole way through. My mother and I have not spoken since the wedding. That has been the hardest part of the story to carry, harder than the vendor calls, harder than the legal letter, harder than the process server on the morning of the ceremony. Not because I believe I made the wrong decision at any step. I have reviewed every decision I made across those 3 weeks, and I cannot identify when I would revise. But correctness and grief are not opposites, and the loss of the relationship that might have been, the version of my mother who might have heard, "This is our wedding," and respected it, is real. Even if the version of her that actually existed never gave me that choice. My therapist and I talk about it. I am not going to pretend it is fully resolved because it isn't. I am 27 years old, and I am married to a man I love in a kitchen that has 2 chairs and a window and very good morning light, and my mother is not in the story I am currently living. That is a true and incomplete sentence that I am learning to hold without requiring it to be a different one. Katherine sent me a final invoice 2 months after the wedding. I paid it the same day. I also sent her a note that said she had been exactly the kind of attorney I needed at exactly the right moment, someone who helped me protect something real without escalating beyond what the situation required. She wrote back one line, "That's the job." I am having that put on something eventually. A mug, maybe. The war room deserves a good mug. Before I close, I want to say something to anyone watching this who recognized something in what I described, not necessarily the specific event, but the dynamic. The person in your life who relates to your milestones as things happening to them rather than things happening to you. The person whose help arrives as control wearing a warmer coat. The person whose love, when thwarted, becomes something that requires a legal letter to manage. You are allowed to have the things you planned. You are allowed to protect the things you built. Saying no to someone who has decided that your life is partly theirs is not cruelty. It is the specific, difficult, necessary act of being a person who gets to exist on their own terms. The wedding was exactly what Daniel and I planned. Every single detail. And the light through the trees at 5:23 in the afternoon was perfect. Leave a comment and tell me, has anyone in your life ever tried to take over something that was yours by claiming they were helping? Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping what mattered? Drop your city and your story. I read every single one. Subscribe to Karma Archives. New story every day: revenge stories, Reddit stories, karma stories, family betrayal, cheating stories, justice served. Real people, real outcomes. The light through those trees was perfect. Subscribe. I'll see you next time.